Well, hello everyone. I'm Des Delahaye from RSK Biocensus, and welcome to this webinar. So today it's going to be my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Pete Walker, who's going to talk to us about native and non-native crayfish in the UK. But first, inevitably, there's some housekeeping issues to tell you about. So I've got 3 points that I need to make. The first is that in order to prevent any barracking or general bad behaviour, all attendees' cameras and mics will be turned off throughout the webinar. But that doesn't mean that we don't want to hear from you, far from it. So if you have any questions, then please post them in the questions dialog box, and we'll try to rattle through as many of those as possible after Pete's finished the presentation. And then finally, just to let you know that sometime after the webinar, you'll be contacted by email to ask for some feedback. So if you could take a few minutes to provide that, that would be great, because it will help us to tailor these events and improve our offerings in the future. So back to the main event. So some of you, I'm sure, will know that this week is Invasive Species Week. And so what better way to mark that than to have a talk on non-native crayfish. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Dr. Pete Walker to take you through his presentation. Off you go, Pete.
Thank you very much, Des, and welcome everybody. This is my second webinar, and it's nice to be back. Hopefully you'll all enjoy this one, and hopefully we'll get some nice questions at the end. So I'm Pete Walker. I work for RSK Biocensus. I'm an associate director there, and I lead our aquatic ecology team. I've been an ecological consultant for about 13 years, a little bit more than 13 years now, specialising predominantly in freshwater ecology. I do a little bit of marine and estuarine stuff as well. And I have a particular interest in fisheries ecology and invasive non-native species. Before I became a consultant all those years ago, I was a research scientist, undertaking scientific research for about 6 years. And that was there was a big focus on fish parasitology, and I particularly specialised in some invasive crustacean fish parasites. I also looked at sustainable aquaculture and freshwater ecology. Just a little bit of background about RSK Biocensus for those of you who aren't familiar with the business. So we consider ourselves a leading ecological consultancy, and we've got an in-house team of, well, I've said about 110 people here. I think it's actually a little bit more than that now. We've been on a big recruitment drive, so that number might be a little bit outdated. It might be close to about 120 by now. So Biocensus, we're an existing organisation who merged with RSK's ecological division back in 2019, and what we're able to do there was bring together some exceptional in-house expertise. So our in-house ecology team, I think back then we had about 50 or so within RSK, and there were about another 15 or 20 or so within RSK Biocensus. So we brought together those experts, both in terms of ecology and project management and delivery. And in addition to that, Biocensus brought along with them a subcontractor network of more than 700 specialist suppliers, so ecological specialists in various different fields that they had gone through a pre-approval process. Again, I think that figure's much higher these days. It's probably close to 1,000 subcontractors that are on our book. So when you combine all that expertise under one roof, it arguably makes us the UK's largest ecology in terms of the skills network that we've got access to. We've got many sector-leading ecologists with expertise ranging from fish to badgers, including expert witness and public inquiries. And if you just look at this map that we've got on the right-hand side of your screen there, so the little pink dots are where we've got our base offices, if you like. And then all of the green ones are places where we've got registered subcontractors. Now, as I've said, this is actually a little bit out of date now, so there's probably a lot more green dots to add, and I believe we've got another couple of pink dots to go on this map as well. But what this does show you, what it should give you an impression of, is the geographical spread that we have. There aren't very many places in the country where you're not pretty close to one of either our in-house ecologists or one of our subcontractors. Just a little bit about aquatic ecology generally at RSK Biocensus. We cover pretty much everything if it's to do with the watery world. So that's, as I said, for myself and some of my colleagues, we cover freshwater, estuarine and marine environments and species. We'll do habitat surveys and assessments. inform on habitat restoration and that sort of thing, water quality surveys and pollution incidents and investigations. We'll do hydrological surveys, so flow gauging, that sort of stuff. Protected species surveys, including, of course, white-clawed crayfish. I've highlighted here invasive non-native species, as it's Invasive Non-Native Species Week. So we've done the full suite of aquatic invasive surveys, from killer shrimps, invasive aquatic plants, all the way up to invasive fish species and crayfish as well. Macroinvertebrate surveys and diatom surveys, all sorts of things that would tie into Water Framework Directive assessment as well, which we can cover. Fish surveys, fish passage and screening. There's not really a lot that we don't do in-house. If you do want more information on any of our aquatic ecology services, you can see my email address there. Don't worry if you're scrabbling for a pen right now and can't find one. Those contact details will be on the very last slide that I put up as well. So just have your pen ready in about 25, 30 minutes time. So what are we going to cover in this presentation today? We're going to talk about what a crayfish is, just in case there are any people on the call that don't know. And then we'll run through some of the crayfish species in the UK. There'll be a bit of a focus on white-clawed crayfish, and I'll explain why I want to talk about those when we get there. And then we're going to have a look at the threats of invasive non-native species generally, and also in particular invasive non-native crayfish threats. A little bit of background on how we think crayfish arrived in the UK, and then we'll go on to some sort of managing options, and you know, how preventing the spread of crayfish is probably better than the cure. So what are crayfish then? So crayfish, first and foremost, are crustaceans. I've got a little picture here. This is my daughter investigating two different types of, well, I say two different types of crustacean, two different species of crustacean. So these are two different species of crab. So the crustaceans includes lobsters, crabs, shrimps, prawns, woodlice, and many parasitic louse species, including the species that I studied for some of my PhD research and research after then. This one here is Argulis japonicus. It's not native to the UK, but you can find it in the UK, and it's quite common and widespread now. And hot off the press, they've just discovered a new species of Argulis. It's known from only a small handful of sites, but it looks like it's quite an invasive parasite. So the infestations that have been seen have been quite high. Argulis mongolis, I think. Forgive me, I should have scribbled down the name before I started this. But watch for some more headlines coming out from the Environment Agency on that one. It is a little bit concerning because it does look like it's a particularly aggressive species of Argulis. So freshwater crayfish look like mini lobsters or saltwater crayfish. There are marine and freshwater species. There are no truly terrestrial crayfish species, but there are some burrowing crayfish species in the US that are referred to as land lobsters. So they tend not to occur so much in waterways or ponds or lakes, but they will occur out in floodplains. And what they tend to do is burrow down on the land until they reach the water table. So they do still need to live in water and be in water to complete their life cycle. So because of that, they're not really land lobsters as such. It's just that they can be found quite significant differences away from water courses. And in addition to that, there are some species of crayfish, in fact the majority of the ones that we're concerned about, that can survive for not insignificant periods out of water. I know myself, I've been along many water courses and found signal crayfish crawling along riverbanks, which is quite an alarming thing to see, and it's one of the things that's helped contribute to their success as an invader. So on to the crayfish species in the UK. It's believed that there are about 7 species found in the wild in the UK at the moment. That includes our native white-clawed crayfish, of which I'm going to talk a little bit more about in a couple of minutes. There's the signal crayfish. Sadly, this is the one that people are probably the most familiar with. It's probably the one that people have seen the most. Our native white-clawed crayfish tends to be a little bit more discreet and a little bit harder to find, whereas these signal crayfish are a little bit more ubiquitous in terms of their distribution. They're not quite as sensitive about the types of habitats that they'll live in. So, and they are in some water courses, the Thames catchment in particular, for example, in quite alarming numbers. You've then got the Turkish or narrow-clawed crayfish, and this one posing very nicely for a photographer for Trevor Reynolds there. There's the spiny cheek crayfish, so called because it's got little spiny cheeks. I'm pointing here with my finger at its spiny cheeks. Of course, you can't see me pointing. You would do if we were in a proper conference. Hopefully, you can see on your screens that just towards the front of its head, there's those little spines on its cheeks. This fantastic looking creature is a red swamp crayfish. These big old long claws on it. It's, you know, that really does look like some sort of alien life form to me. It's quite a remarkable looking thing. And we've got the noble crayfish, and the last one that's banned is the virile crayfish. In addition to those that we know are here and already occurring in the wild, there are also 2 other species that are considered at high risk of introduction to the UK waterways. There's the red claw crayfish. This grows to quite a significant size, and it's been kept in the aquarium trade. Surprising that it gets kept in the aquarium trade because it does grow quite big, but there are quite a few examples of things that people acquire for hobby aquariums and they end up growing too large, and as a result they need to get rid of them, and that's how some invasive species, of course, have ended up in our waterways. And there's also this quite attractive looking little crayfish called the marbled crayfish. Now, neither of those have been confirmed in the wild in the UK yet, but because of their popularity in the aquarium trade, they are considered quite high risk. So we're going to move on to white-clawed crayfish now. As I said, we're just going to have a little bit of a focus on this species. It's the only freshwater crayfish species that's considered to be native to the UK. It's found in a variety of different freshwater habitats where there are suitable refuges. It's predominantly found in flowing watercourses, so streams and rivers, but it is found in some isolated quarry sites. Some of those have been have had populations deliberately introduced as ark sites, and there's also a famous population up in Malham Tarn, where that's occurring in a lake site, but predominantly they're occurring in flowing waters. Also usually found in relatively shallow water, whether that's just a coincidence or a reflection of the places where people find them easiest. It's obviously a lot easier to find something in shallow water than it is deeper water. But even trapping exercises have seemed to show that this species prefers to be in shallow water. There aren't very many records of them being found in water deeper than 2 meters, and it's rare that they're found in water as deep as 2 meters, to be fair. They're omnivorous, they'll eat pretty much anything. And this is quite an important note here. It's estimated that about 25% of the global population lives in the UK. So that's a quarter of all the crayfish in the white-clawed crayfish in the world are occurring in UK waters. That means that our populations are quite important, not just to our own country's biodiversity, but also to the global population of white-clawed crayfish. That means that we have an obligation, both a moral one and a legal one, to conserve and protect this species. And when you look at these little tiny juvenile ones, why wouldn't you want to protect those lovely little creatures? Species is at high risk from a number of different things. There are a number of threats to white-clawed crayfish. A big one, which is common for many of our native species, is habitat degradation. I put this news article up here. This was quite a high-profile case on the River Lug, where a farmer took his bulldozer into the river and decided to modify the habitat himself. There's an ongoing legal debate about this and who's, whether he's liable to be prosecuted and whatnot. It's quite high profile. There's a lot of stuff on the internet, but there's no doubt about it. Somebody takes a bulldozer into a river that's got white-clawed crayfish in it, and there's a high likelihood that white-clawed crayfish themselves will have been damaged, and also the habitat will have been altered significantly and is now perhaps not suitable for that species to exist in. Another high-profile media example here, water quality. If any of you haven't seen this panorama programme on river pollution in the UK, I would strongly urge you to have a watch. It is quite an eye-opener and quite enlightening. There's some very interesting information and revelations in that programme. It's well worth a watch. But water quality, if we're not protecting the water quality in our waterways, it's creating inhospitable environments, not just for white-clawed crayfish, but for many other wildlife species as well that inhabit those waters. Abstraction, so as we abstract water from our watercourses, we reduce the availability of water. It can also impact water quality. It can result in higher than expected or higher than what we consider normal water temperatures, and also affect other water quality parameters that might be linked to that. So things like dissolved oxygen levels and the likes. Predation is another one. I'm not sure how clear this will be on your screen. Perhaps if you all lean really close and peer at your screens, you should be able to see that littering this rock are crayfish parts. This was actually quite a unique occurrence. So we're surveying a site up in Yorkshire, and it was during a particularly hot summer, and water levels in this stream were quite low. And there were crayfish carcasses littering the banks everywhere, absolutely dozens of them, most of the rocks were. And there's also a huge amount of otter sprains about as well. And what we think was happening is that as the water levels have reduced and the water temperatures rose, the dissolved oxygen availability was, the dissolved oxygen concentration within that watercourse was depleted to a point where crayfish were actually coming up to the shallow marginal habitat so that they could bubble air at over the gills at the surface. And as a result of that, and probably some slightly more sluggish behaviour from the crayfish, it was making them easy pickings for birds and otters. So it was absolute carnage and a bit of a shame to see. But it was a completely natural occurrence, unless you want to blame global warming caused by humans, of course. But predation can be a significant impact on crayfish. And we also get predation on crayfish from non-native invasive species. So mink will happily munch on large numbers of crayfish, as will the crayfish species as well. Illegal harvesting, it's probably not as big an issue as it was, but it is incredibly important that we keep tabs on people that are going out and trapping crayfish to eat the table. There's been quite a few TV programs advocating the capture of crayfish for cooking. They have said it's the non-native ones that you should be catching, but there is a danger that people are taking native crayfish. I don't think it's the biggest issue facing the species, far from it, but it is something to be aware of. And education, of course, is the key there, making people aware that if they take the native ones, that's a very bad thing, and that taking the non-native ones isn't necessarily a good thing. And I'll come on to that in another slide. And as I said, so invasive non-native species, they can also have an impact. I'm not sure there are many waterways where the Wells catfish and white-clawed crayfish are occurring together, but I just happen to have a nice picture of a catfish, so I thought I'd include it as something different from a crayfish. But there are other invasive non-native species that will predate on them, and they'll also compete with them. So we talked about the other crayfish species found in the UK as competitors. They can carry diseases, which can have significant impact on our crayfish as well. So invasive non-native species are not good for our white-clawed crayfish. And I put here, this is a quote from an article that I wrote for Inside Ecology a couple of years back. And I've said that because of the high risk to extant populations, all sites are considered, this extant population of white-clawed crayfish, all sites where they occur are considered important for long-term survival of the species. And that really is critical. White-clawed crayfish are significantly under threat, but there are still plenty of populations occurring in places where invasive species haven't got to them, and it's imperative that we protect them, so that we protect them from the spread of invasive non-native species and the impacts associated with that, that we protect them from habitat degradation and pollution and all of these sorts of things, and that, you know, they really are seen as very treasured things that we need to conserve. So in terms of the threats of non-native species, this Himalayan balsam, I should say those seed pods have little seeds in that are great to sprinkle in your salad. Just be careful that you make sure you cup your hand over them when you collect them, so that you don't inadvertently let the seeds explode and fly all over the place, and you're aiding the spread then, because that wouldn't be a good thing. So invasive species are arguably the biggest threat to global biodiversity. They can spread disease and parasites, they can damage ecosystems, and they compete with native species, and they can, in some cases, they can predate upon native species. There are economic impacts associated with them. So this is Himalayan balsam, this is Japanese knotweed. In terms of invasive species generally, it's estimated that the cost to the UK annually is £1.7 billion, which is a phenomenal amount of money. And Japanese knotweed alone, it's estimated that costs the UK economy £166 million a year. That's a huge amount of money. And I think when we're trying to get through to people the importance of invasive species, you know, we can talk about the moral issues of protecting our white-club crayfish, and a lot of people say, well, who really cares if it disappears? Let's fill our rivers with signal crayfish and then we can all eat them. But it's when you look at this cost, when that starts hitting people's pockets, that's when people realise that these things are important as well. Money really does talk. There are also health and social impacts. So erosion and flooding. I've got a picture here of some signal crayfish burrows along a riverbank. This is the River Even lode. You can see the colour of the water as well. That's exacerbated by the presence of crayfish and their sort of feeding actions, the way they move around and burrow. But you can see this bank here is clearly unstable. It's crumbled in the past, and that can contribute to erosion of banks. It can change the dynamics of the flow patterns within a river, and that can affect flooding and those sorts of things as well. There are also some plant species that, floating pennywort, for example, can clog waterways and increase flood risk. And in terms of the health risks, you've got giant hogweed and oak processionary moth there. Both of those two things are one's a plant, one has a particularly hairy caterpillar, and both of those can cause significant harm to people. So hogweed, if you touch it and get the blisters from it, that hypersensitizes your skin to sunlight for a long time. So you can actually get the blisters coming back year on year just from one contact with giant hogweeds. You know, these invasive species can seriously affect our health as well. So in terms of threats of non-native crayfish, well, a lot of these are similar to some of the things for invasive species generally. It's competition with our native species, not just native crayfish, but also other species that might be occurring. They predate upon them. They can carry diseases. So crayfish plague, the fungal disease carried by several different species of invasive crayfish, can affect our white-club crayfish. They're not, the invasive ones are not affected by it, but our own native crayfish species are. And that's an important consideration for biosecurity, and I'll come on to biosecurity shortly. They can degrade habitat. I showed you the picture of the eroded bank there and the colour of the water. It can affect water quality, and we just talked about erosion and flood risk. So how did they arrive in the UK? Well, there's some speculation about this, but signal crayfish were known to be introduced to specific farms in the 1970s to be farmed for food. So these were crayfish farms for aquaculture facilities. The resulting spread was believed to be a combination of escapees and some deliberate, albeit illegal, introductions. And signal crayfish in particular, but this also applies to some of the other crayfish species, are exceptional invaders because they have a non-selective diet. They will eat pretty much anything and everything, including lots of things we don't want them to eat, like native fish eggs and our native crayfish. They have a very high reproductive ability. You'll be able to see from this particularly large buried female, you can see the number of eggs underneath. And I've seen crayfish with probably 2 or 3 times that number of eggs beneath them before. So they can reproduce and produce a huge number of young each year. And I mentioned earlier, they have this ability to travel over land. So they're not just confined to the water body that they're in, they can actually climb out of that water body and crawl across land into neighbouring watercourses, particularly if it's not too far. I've just put here some other dates of some other crayfish species that are occurring in the UK. So you can see most of them seem to occur around that 1970s, 1980s period when there was a bit of a boom in the interest in eating crayfish and crayfish farming. Some of them, the spiny cheek was believed to be a little bit later than that, but it was that sort of period, and it was all linked to, as I say, this interest in farming crayfish and eating crayfish. And the virile crayfish was just a little bit later still. So the important question is, what do we do about managing crayfish invasions? I've listed 5 options here that we're just going to go on to talk about. If we start with biosecurity, so I mentioned earlier about the importance of biosecurity for stopping the spread of crayfish plague. This is top of the list in terms of our armoury against invasive non-native species. If we can stop them arriving here, or we can stop them spreading from where they're currently occurring, we've won half the fight. Once we start allowing them to spread and occupy, the problem just escalates exponentially. So biosecurity is absolutely imperative. And we've got put this page up here from the Non-Native Species Secretariat about stopping the spread. So check, clean, dry. We've probably got quite a few people on this presentation from the Environment Agency, from ecological consultancies and from rivers trusts. we're the sort of people who are out in water bodies day after day for our job, and we have to lead the fight on this. I think back to some of the things that I might have done in my early career when we've had to survey multiple sites in a single day, and this knowledge and awareness of biosecurity was not as high. It didn't seem quite as important. It wasn't being pushed, and it's frightening to think of the number of people that were switching between watercourses and perhaps not disinfecting or using different equipment. We know now, so there's no excuse. This information is out there, and as professionals, we really have to stick to that and make sure that we're doing our bit and educating people as we go as well. So it's about investing in sufficient equipment to enable you to use new equipment in different watercourses, making sure that when you plan projects, you plan in time for checking, cleaning and drying your kit. It's hugely important. Trapping, so it's quite a controversial one. Lots of people say, why don't we just trap and eat them all? Trapping typically has quite a low success rate for smaller juvenile crayfish. I've actually got the trap in the picture here. I'm not sure whether you can see, but we modified this one to enable us to capture smaller individuals as well. So we put a finer mesh on the inside of it, basically. But most crayfish traps, the size of the mesh or the apertures on them allows the smaller ones to escape. And one of the problems with that is that by trapping, you're generally targeting the bigger ones, and bigger crayfish are cannibalistic. So what you can end up with is a higher density of smaller juveniles, which eventually boost your crayfish population because you're removing one of the population controls by taking out those bigger adults. It requires a huge amount of effort, and you've got to trap in with a huge number of traps and keep it going for a significant period of time to have any sort of impact. And as I said, it's unlikely to remove all the crayfish, so it would need to be repeated again and again just to keep on top of them. There's also a risk of capturing non-target species as well, of course, and there are biosecurity risks if people aren't adequately trained and they're not making sure that they check, clean and dry and that sort of thing, or if people are collecting the crayfish for consumption and moving around, there's always a risk of an escapee in the back of your truck that can crawl its way out or something like that. Predation. So crayfish do have predators. We have a bet internally at RSK about whether I'll get eels mentioned in every meeting that we have, particularly amongst the senior management team. And lo and behold, I've managed to get eels into my presentation here. So success on that part. I'm not sure who wins the tenner for that one. But eels will predate upon crayfish. And this study that was done in 2014 showed that a high density of eels can result in high predation rates on red swamp crayfish. And Blake and Hart in 95, so preceding the 2014 study, they did a study with signal crayfish and perch and eels, and they found that perch in particular were quite effective at predating upon crayfish. The problem that we've got with this is, most of these things were done in controlled lab experiments, and the wild situation is very much a different kettle of fish, and these species are not going to focus only on crayfish, far from it. So in terms of a method for actually controlling crayfish, I don't think it holds much hope. Biocidal control, so that's the use of different chemicals to treat them. There have been several trials. So Stephanie PA in 2019 published a paper along with some other researchers where they did several trials. The problem with biocides is that most are not species specific, and they can therefore cause harm or eradication of non-target species. And that's something that we absolutely don't want to do. So that you can look at the use of treated baits, that has been suggested, but again, you're not going to eliminate that potential impact on non-target species. There's further research needed on bioaccumulation as well, so it could be bioaccumulating in other species or in the wider environment. And nobody knows an awful lot about the potential for the evolution of resistance. So it's one of those areas. I think there is promise there. There are chemicals that will work against crayfish, but we need a bit more research. And ideally, we need research on chemicals that will directly affect crayfish, but not other species. And I think that's going to be quite tricky, because generally, if it will work against crayfish, it will work against shrimps and all sorts of other things that we don't want it to work on. And then you've got autocidal control. So this is using things like irradiation to reduce male fertility, but it's a labour-intensive approach. So you've got to trap and irradiate large numbers of crayfish in order to have an impact. So it's great if you can irradiate them, release these sterile ones into the environment, they'll compete but not reproduce, so it can help to reduce numbers. But as I say, it's hugely labour intensive. It could be combined with intensive trapping, so you intensively trap and sterilise, and you're getting both things going on at the same time. But as I say, it's a labour intensive approach. And I think field trials at selected locations are needed to give us a bit more information on those. There are a few other options that could be explored, and some of them at least might be worth pursuing. So I've put a few here. The use of sexual attractants, so pheromones or pheromone substitutes, to try and attract crayfish into traps more successfully to speed up that trapping process. For aquaculture situations where people are farming the species, making sure that they only farm monosex populations so that if they do escape, they don't have the potential to reproduce in the wild. Silencing of key hormones, mentioned here about sterile male releases, and you've also got oral delivery of biocides, which we mentioned earlier, so putting baits down that contain chemicals that will kill off crayfish or sterilise them perhaps. But with all of these options, the difficulty is finding research funding to enable efficient trials to be conducted. And that's the key with many things. We've got some good ideas, we've got things that need further exploration, but it's finding the research funding to enable those tests and those experiments and those field trials to be undertaken with a suitable level of rigour to enable meaningful statistics to be run them and meaningful conclusions to be drawn. And that's one of the key issues that we've got. So I think we're just about bang on time coming up to the last slide. I think I was due to finish at 1 and we're just past 1 o'clock mark, so almost perfect timing there. So just to summarise then, invasive non-native crayfish continued to spread throughout the UK. I think we're going to see that spread continuing for many years yet. That means there's an increasing threat to our native flora and fauna, but conservationists should not falter in the face of adversity. I was at a Rivers Trust meeting not so long ago, so I have some involvement in Rivers Trusts, and we're looking at flagship species for funding, and the usual suspects were mentioned, so Atlantic salmon, brown trout, European eel, those sorts of things. And I mentioned about white-clawed crayfish, and there was a response that white-clawed crayfish were a waste of time to focus on because their fate was now sealed. We were going to end up with no white-clawed crayfish at some point because of the spread of invasive non-native species. And it gained quite a bit of support. There was quite a lot of people agreed with that approach. And I was a little bit horrified because, you know, my view of a conservationist is that we come in at those times when things do look dire for species, unfortunately, and we're the people who fight the good fight to say, well, we won't give up until the last one is gone. And that's where I feel we should be at with the white-clawed crayfish. There are still plenty of populations hanging on around the UK, and some of them are doing incredibly well. And it's so important that we safeguard those. There are also huge numbers of watercourses in the UK where we don't have any data currently on whether there are white-clawed crayfish populations present or invasive crayfish populations present, or watercourses where we know that white-clawed crayfish were present 10, 15, 20 years ago, but they haven't been surveyed again since. So we need that information, we need that data if we're going to protect them. But it does come down to the whole question of, well, who's going to collect that data? Where are those resources coming from? And usually that's a question of money at the end of the day. So there are options to be explored, but further funding is required. That question of money again, and where should we be diverting our funds? But as I mentioned in the previous slides, we do have options to tackle invasive crayfish threats, but they do require intensive effort. They do require further research in some cases. And again, that comes down to resources and funding in most cases. But I've put this here, minimising the spread is the top priority. So it has to be our top one. We have to stop the situation getting any worse than it already is if we're to have any hope for the future. So this check, clean, dry, I'm sure this is fully supported by the Non-Native Species Secretariat and also DEFRA, the Environment Agency, SEPA, Scottish Government. All of these different people will all back this. And as people working in the water industry, as many of you on this webinar are today, we can be leading the way on that. You know, we're out on those watercourses. We have an obligation to do our bit to make sure we minimise the spread, but also to help educate other people. And that's a good point to finish on. As promised, I've put up this slide at the end that has my contact details on, so you can get in touch after this event. You can either do that through the event organisers and they'll pass on your queries to me, or you can make a note of those details there. I'm more than happy if you want to drop me an email or give me a call directly. And I think that leaves us with about 10 or 15 minutes or so for questions. So I'll hand back over to Des, if that's okay.
Great, thanks very much, Pete. Well, I might have known that you'd sneak in a picture of an eel somewhere along the line. So well done for that again. Yeah, we've got a few questions for you, Pete. And, so let me start with this one. You described that there are some isolated populations of white-clawed crayfish still around, and that they're not yet affected by non-native species. So I was just going to ask, what do you think is the single most important thing we can do to protect those populations and to allow them then to spread further?
There's no one single thing that we should be doing. There's a few, but top of the list of the things that we're doing, as I mentioned in an earlier slide, is that biosecurity. So making sure that we do everything we can to stop the spread. So it's checking, cleaning and drying. So, you know, if we've been working water courses, and this goes for professionals, but also recreational water body users. So that's the angling community, the boating community, even down to dog walkers that allow the dogs to go and run in rivers. It's checking, and this doesn't just apply to crayfish, but invasive species generally. So checking that we're not taking organisms or fragments of plants or those sorts of things out of water bodies and transmitting them to other water bodies, carrying them over there. Cleaning any equipment that has been in there, and if needs be, sterilizing it and drying it. So most of these things that are occurring in aquatic environments, they don't like being dry. So if we can put them at a reasonable temperature, so nothing too cool, get it in a nice warm drying room or something like that, and let them dry for at least 48 hours, there's a pretty good chance that most of the nasties that might be clinging to our kit would have been affected by then and not be able to be transferred to other water bodies. Certainly at RSK, we have a multi-pronged approach. So all of our field scientists will take out biosecurity kits with them, and they, you know, it sounds something grand, but it's not really. It's a bucket that contains a hoof pick for picking things out of your boots. It's got Virkon disinfectant tablets that can be mixed with water and sprayed onto our kit, some cloths to wipe things down. It's all very simple stuff, and stuff that can be picked up for peanuts from your local hardware stores or off the internet. And we also make sure that when we're planning aquatic surveys, that we will always work in a upstream to downstream direction, so that we're not carrying things from downstream reaches to the upstream reaches and transmitting things there. And we'll make sure that we take sufficient equipment so that if we do have to move between water courses, that we're able to do so and use different equipment in the different water courses if we're doing that on the same day and don't have the option to dry. So that biosecurity is absolutely paramount. I would urge everyone, the non-native species secretariat actually have some excellent e-learning modules on biosecurity and invasive non-native species risks, and I've encouraged all of our team to take those modules. At least modules 1 and 3 I think are the two most important. So as a minimum, all of our staff have done those, and I would encourage other people to do. But the other one, as I said, is protecting those environments that white-clawed crayfish occur in. So we've got to stop the spread, make sure that the spread of invasive species isn't something that's impacting them further. But where they are occurring, we've still got a huge number of other threats to them. Water quality issues, so runoff from agricultural land, discharges from sewage treatment works, accidental spills, runoff from roads. All of these sorts of things are adversely affecting them. Habitat modification, so dredging and all these sorts of things have a huge impact on the habitat for these species. So we need to be looking at that more holistic approach. And some of those things, if we're reducing pollution risks and we're reducing habitat degradation or improving habitat, they don't just benefit crayfish, of course, they're going to be benefiting lots of other aquatic life and riparian life and beyond as well.
Okay, great. Thanks, Pete. So we've got another question here. This is a methodological question, really. Do you see eDNA as a valuable method for understanding the spread of invasive crayfish, particularly in large areas where data is extremely minimal?
Yeah, I do. So eDNA is it's been highlighted in recent years because of its widespread use for great crested newt surveys. but its application is becoming more and more widespread within the industry, particularly within aquatic environments. I know it's used for looking at other species as well. So bat poo, for example, they look at the DNA in bat poo. I think it does have value. I've got, I think we've still got a little bit of a way to go before it's the tried and tested method. I saw a study presented at an IFM conference not too long ago, a couple of years back, looking at topmouth gudgeon populations. And what struck me there was that eDNA is, like many of our methods, it's only as good as the quality of the data that you're collecting. And it's often been sort of sold as all you need to do is take one water sample, send it off to the analyst, and you've got your answers to whether they're in a watercourse. But it's not true. You often need to take multiple samples to ensure that you've definitely got an adequate result. So in this particular study for topmouth gudgeon, they believed that they'd eradicated it from 3 small water bodies. And then a few years later, it was about 3 years later, anglers started reporting sightings. So they went back to the water bodies and took multiple samples for eDNA analysis. And I think they took about 20 samples from one of these ponds, and 3 of those samples came back positive for topmouth gudgeon. So great result, they confirmed they're present. But I asked the question during that presentation, if you'd have only taken 17 samples and not those 3 that came back positive, your result would have been negative. So how can we be sure that we can trust the results from eDNA analysis? And it was probably the one question that the presenter didn't want to be asked, because the answer is you can't be 100% sure. With any survey technique, it's rare that you can be 100% certain of absence. You can always be 100% certain of presence if you get a positive result that you know that they're there. But proving absence is much trickier. And I think that's complicated further when we get to flowing water bodies. Obviously, when you're in a river environment, the water's moving all the time, and that means that any eDNA that is deposited in that environment is also moving. So if you take a sample within a watercourse and it shows, for example, that an invasive species is present, if you take that down at the bottom of that river, the bottom end of it, and you take a river that's the length of the River Severn or the River Wye, for example, huge rivers, if you take it at the bottom, you've no idea where in that catchment that eDNA has come from, or at least you don't with any certainty. The way that you can get around that, of course, is doing strategic sampling at multiple points all the way up through a watercourse and making sure you then sample the different tributaries. But that starts to massively elevate the cost, both in terms of the resources required to go and collect the samples, but also the cost in terms of analysing the large number of samples that you would need. It's got its value, and I think there are certain circumstances where there's no question that it will be a useful tool, particularly where traditional survey techniques might not be particularly suitable or might not be proving as robust as we'd like. But I don't think it's the ultimate answer just yet. I think we'll start seeing more of it, and I think we'll start seeing more a wider use of eDNA for all sorts of things, invasive species and protected species. And I know our colleagues over in the ADAS lab are doing quite a bit of R&D on developing eDNA standards for lots of different species. But yeah, in the end.
So until we do get to the point where perhaps eDNA is a more reliable, or at least we understand its limitations better for surveying for crayfish, what are the best methods you would recommend?
Probably the most successful method is going to be hand searches, so manual searching of refuges and making sure that you search a sufficient number of refuges. This comes back to the rigor of your survey again. It's always the more samples you can take, the better, and the more refuges you can search, the more confidence you can have in detecting presence or absence of these species. So those manual searches do involve getting in a watercourse and turning over stones and searching under undercut banks or under vegetation, that sort of thing. That's got to be our best approach. I think that's the most successful, but there are some situations where that's just not possible, either because the water is too deep or because the water is too turbid. The other options that you can apply in those sorts of cases are nighttime torching. So crayfish are generally more active under the hours of darkness. So if it's clear water conditions, but perhaps just a little bit too deep for you to get in and do a manual search effectively, you can go back after dark with a high-powered torch and scan the riverbed for them. Or you can put in baited traps, and you can leave the traps in for a period of time and then go back and check the traps. And trapping in particular is a useful tool in deeper watercourses, and particularly deeper watercourses where it's quite turbid water and you can't see through it if you were doing a manual search or torching.
Okay, thanks. I think we've got time for just one more question, and it's something that you didn't really touch upon very much at all in the presentation, which is this issue of a fungus being transmitted amongst non-native and native crayfish, and that being just another threat really for the white-clawed crayfish, as if it needed another one. Would you like to say a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the fungus, it's been around for quite a while now, and it's thought it arrived with the American cousins of our native white-clawed crayfish. I'm not going to try and say the Latin name because my pronunciation of Latin is shocking at best, but it's a fungal disease that it doesn't just occur on the crayfish, it can actually occur within the watercourse where the crayfish are present as well. So that does mean that if we were surveying in a watercourse, for example, or if your dog went running into a river and splashed around where signal crayfish were present that were harbouring this fungal disease, and then went into a watercourse where white-clawed crayfish were present, there could be fungal spores retained in water droplets on its fur that could very easily be transferred, or in the case of people, on our waders, or if we're using survey nets, or even anglers fishing nets, these sorts of things could all be harbouring water droplets that contain these fungal spores. So it's really easy for it to transfer. The American signal crayfish and several other invasive crayfish species are immune to this fungal disease. They're not affected by it at all. But our white-clawed crayfish and one or two of the other invasive crayfish species, they are affected by it, and it's lethal to them. So if that fungal disease gets into the watercourses and affects those crayfish, unfortunately, those populations of crayfish are probably doomed. There's not an awful lot you can do at that stage once that fungal pathogen has got a hold.
Okay, right, that's rather a depressing note to finish on, but I think we're going to have to wind it up there. There are several more questions that I would love to have had the time to ask you, Pete. So what we'll do, though, everyone, is we'll try to answer those other questions that have arisen by email somehow. So we'll get Pete beavering away at some answers to those over the course of the next few days, and so hopefully you'll hear more and your questions will not go unanswered. So thanks everyone. Thanks, Pete, for a brilliant presentation. Thanks everyone for joining us. Just a reminder before we go that you will receive an email asking for some feedback. If you could take just a few minutes to fill out the form and send it back, that would be really super. You'll hear, if you're on our mailing list, then you should hear about our next First Thursday webinar, which I think now is going to be in July, and it's some chap called Des Delahaye who's doing it, I believe. So look out for that one. So I hope to see you then, and in the meantime, take care of yourselves, and thanks very much for joining in. Goodbye from me.
Don't forget to check clean dry, of course, people. Keep that biosecurity in mind.
Nice one. Cheers. Bye-bye, everyone.
Cheers, everyone.